Hello students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 22, Lesson 2. It's called Women and Progressives. It's basically our lesson on women and their roles in the progressive movements. We're going to talk about everything that they sort of did in that time period. Really, two big ones would be women's suffrage and then the Prohibition era. So let's get into this. The times, they are changing. I've said it before. I'm sure I'll say it again. Today's lesson is all about the ladies, which is a lesson we have every few chapters. We go, okay, what were women doing in this time? There were big changes for women in the mid-1800s. Now we're hitting the late 1800s and early 1900s, and changes are going to be even more significant. Today we talk about new roles for women. I think of Wonder Woman, strong, powerful woman. I think her first movie is taking place in this era. So the times women lived in helped to make their movement, their movement for more rights more possible. This is going to sound a little crazy, but it was technology that really made a lot of these movements, these women's movements, possible. Why? Well, farming technology made it so less people had to farm. So more people were moving into the cities. And when you're in the city, you don't need to have as many children. Farmers had a ton of children because they needed their children to help them work the farm. But now you have new technology, so people are not only moving away from the farms, but the farmers are having less children because they don't need as many laborers. And so basically between that and then the fact that housework is becoming easier for new technologies, you have a lot of women with more free time on their hands. And what do they do with that free time? Education. They use it to become more educated. By 1910, 40% of all college students were women, and the female workforce between 1918 and 1910 doubled. Basically, the ladies had more time, and they were going to hit the ground running. They were going to use it well. Take note, education is what lifted them from their station and made some of these, rights and movements possible. So the new woman was at the time the educated modern woman that pursued interests outside of the home. It's a far cry from the traditional housewife that dominated most cultures of the world up until that point in time. The sort of poster child of the modern woman was Jane Addams. We've actually learned about Jane Addams. She set up the Hull House in Chicago, which was a settlement house, sort of like a social service building where classes were taught and there were beds and classes to help the poor. Things like that. In that particular instance, for Miss Addams, it gave her a location, something to do in which to pour her efforts, her passion, and her intelligence. Other women were soon to follow. Women joined forces. Women started to join these women's clubs, lady-only clubs that often had some kind of focus, like music or art or something they were interested in. And there were a whole bunch of clubs. Growth rapidly increased during this era because we said women had more free time. But regardless, there were, limitations to them. For example, there were clubs that would only take white women, and then you ended up having clubs for only colored women. But regardless, they all ended up kind of doing the same thing. A lot of them started off with a non-political or social topic like art, and then moved into the realm of women's rights, establishing hospitals or social programs or orphanages, things like that. They were getting political. They were getting on the scene. One of the biggest things that they worked on in this era was voting. So we have our next section here, Women in Voting. We learned way back in MP3 about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention, where the women came together and almost sort of had their own Congress. Stanton and her friend Susan B. Anthony practically started the women's rights movement with that convention. A lot of those women had been abolitionists, and then after the Civil War they became suffragists. So women's suffrage is the right of women to vote. These women, like Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, led that suffrage movement for like 50 years, helping to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, many working-class women also wanted the right to vote. They wanted to elect leaders that would improve working conditions, specifically for women. In the 1910s, women really started to put the heat on lawmakers. There were marches in Washington, D.C. One suffragist, Alice Paul, met with President Woodrow Wilson to talk about suffrage and equal rights for women, and when the president refused to sort of support her, there were protests outside the White House, and some of these protesters, these lady protesters that wanted to vote, were arrested. The arrested women actually held a hunger strike in prison, and this put enormous pressure on the government and really brought a lot of attention to the subject. People sympathize with them. Now, by 1917, the tide of public opinion had shifted in favor of women's suffrage. President Wilson changed his mind on the topic and decided to support women's suffrage. That was huge. A number of states were granting women the right to vote. In 1918, an amendment for women's suffrage passed the House. The next year, it passed the Senate. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment of the Constitution was ratified by 3/4 of the states required, just in time for that year's presidential election. So women first voted in the 1920 presidential election. The 19th Amendment says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Male, female, doesn't matter, you can vote now. Alright, quickly on women and social reform. Women's suffrage may be the most notable cause for women. However, they were involved in a great deal more. They staffed schools and supported schools and libraries and orphanages and settlement houses. They were very involved in the social scene and education. They pressured the government to create the Children's Bureau and the Labor Department. They were also played a large role in getting more government support for widows and abandoned mothers with children. So all good causes. Don't forget, at this time, women were becoming more active in the labor movement. For example, the Women's Trade Union League worked to get women to join unions and improve working conditions. Remember, there was big problems like with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And on our last major topic, the temperance movement. Women were at the forefront of the temperance movement, calling for prohibition, or the outlaw of the making and selling of alcohol in the United States of America. The women's organization pushed temperance, the women's organizations that pushed this, there were two main organizations: the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was formed all the way back in 1874, and the Anti-Saloon League, which is less of a mouthful, which was created in 1893. Now, why did they want to ban booze? Well, for some, it was just the moral thing to do. They were morally against alcohol and what it does to your body. Others cited the impact of booze on society, such as creating poverty, domestic abuse, crime, and the breakup of families. All of these things were problems that women suffered from more, and then men would, blow the paycheck at the bar and on booze instead of bringing it home to help the family. So I think we can empathize with those causes. Their efforts were successful after decades and decades. I mean, you're talking the one that started in, what did we say? 1874. Finally, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution is ratified in the year 1919, which is called the Prohibition Law. That means in 1919, the U.S. government outlawed the manufacture, sales, and transport of alcohol in the whole United States. That means, vodka, rum, any type of liquor, beer, it was wine, it was all outlawed in the United States for over 10 years. It was basically redacted. It was reversed with the 23rd Amendment passed in 1933. But that means from 1919 to 1933 there was no booze in the United States, which is pretty crazy. It was a major victory for the women of the progressive era, despite the fact that it would be basically, overtaken later. For your assignment today, sort of an opinion question on the topic of prohibition. Prohibition, the outlaw of alcohol in the United States, was a controversial move. Some people were all about it. However, a lot of folks, such as these gentlemen here, liked their booze. Men and urban folk in general, liked their booze, with women and more rural populations being for prohibition, against the booze. I want you to watch this short video below, which will hopefully work when you're here, and then answer the writing prompt. It's like a 3-minute video, just a little bit more information on prohibition. The question is that I want you to answer in this discussion thread, so that means you can see each other's answers even though you can't directly reply. What do you think of prohibition? Do you think it was a good idea or a bad idea, and why? Now, you will note this is a discussion thread, so you can see other people's responses, so answer intelligently, answer well, check your spelling and grammar, and most of all, be respectful. Don't do anything like, I think alcohol is stupid and anyone that supports it is stupid. That would be an example of being disrespectful and inflammatory. Don't be like that. Just be like, I really don't support the selling of alcohol in the United States. I would have supported prohibition, and this is my reason why, ABC. Intelligent and respectful. That's what we're going for here. But I do want you to be able to see other people's opinions. Maybe after you read a few, it might even change your mind. But there is no right or wrong answer. Keep that in mind. As long as you answer the question and answer it with a few sentences intelligently, you'll get full points. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll keep chugging along. Have a good one.